for coming out tonight. I'm Barbara Tolliver, co-owner of The Traveler, and again, we welcome you to this first event of 2020. As we begin our 25th year at The Traveler, our engagement remains at the community level, but our context is national and global. Here's a very Bainbridge way that works. Fran came in to buy a map of South Africa, and of course I asked why, and she said, well, David was going to be giving one of the keynote addresses at the Global Conference of the Club of Rome. I just find I want to use any opportunity to say that, the Club of Rome. And as well as to have a number of other engagements in South Africa. And I thought that sounded pretty spectacular. And we are so proud of the Kortens and what they bring and represent to our Bainbridge community. And then that was November. In December, I happened to run into David on the street. And I said, how was it? It was wonderful. And were there any events scheduled for him to talk about that experience? And he said, well, none that I know of. And then finding out that we could be the follow-up to the Club of Rome, I pounced. But you folks represent the other part of that equation because it really takes community to bring this sort of focus and attention to important matters. Tonight we have, our focus will be on the issues of justice and equality and sustainability that these two pathfinders have represented throughout their professional lives. But Fran, you know, as the executive director publisher of Yes Magazine, she and David both have taught at Harvard and at the Haile Selassie University in Ethiopia. Their work at the Ford Foundation took them all over the world. They both have doctorates from Stanford, I might add. Nothing to sneeze at all. David, noted academic, economist, thought leader, and author of groundbreaking books, most famously When Corporations Rule the World. He is co-founder of Yes Magazine and remains a board member, co-founder of the Living Economies Forum, a founder of the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, on and on. But what I think I like perhaps best to sum it up was the statement across his website, seeking a pathway to the future that works for all of us. So we welcome them tonight as they bring to us and engage in discussion of reflections on the South Africa experience. Welcome. So
thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank Barbara so much for that overly generous introduction, and Susan and Pam Christensen. We so appreciate your creating a space like this, and so welcome vibrant local businesses. Target would not put on an event like this. So this is the kind of space we value and what makes living on Bainbridge so special. How many of you came here to see animals? Oh, I'm so glad, because you're not going to see any animals at all. We did not go to game parks. We've done game parks. But on February 11th, if that's your interest, you can come here and learn all about African animals. How many of you saw the movie Invictus with Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon? Do you remember that? Really fantastic movie. Dave and I watched it again. You may recall Mandela has become president, and there are those among his black constituency who say it's time to squash rugby. It's a white game. It's a symbol of apartheid, and we want to get them kicked out of the whole rugby thing, and it's not our sport. It's not South Africa. And Mandela said, no, he had learned in prison how much rugby meant to his jailers, and he was not going to shut it down. And instead, he said, let's bring rugby to the townships and begin to make rugby part of our national heritage. So he was elected in 1994, and in 1995, South Africa won the World Cup in rugby. And it was this incredible moment. We arrived in Cape Town on November 2nd. And on November 2nd, in Japan, South Africa had just won the Rugby World Cup. And the country was absolutely jubilant. And the newspapers were just full of this excitement about this incredible victory. So it was the third. So there was the victory at the time of Mandela, and then in 2007 they won the World Cup again when Thabo Mbeki was the president, and now in 2019 with Cyril Ramaphosa the president, they won again. And what was especially exciting about this victory was, for the first time in the history of South Africa, the captain of the team was black. Siya Kolisi. I learned if I said Siya Kolisi to our taxi driver or to any of our friends or anybody on the street, everybody lights up. Siya Kolisi was a magic word. One of the things that struck Dave and me about in our visit to South Africa was the willingness to be honest about the past. So that manifested itself in a number of ways. One of which is the making Robben Island, where Mandela was in prison for 18 years, a total of 27, but not all in Robben Island, to make that a kind of a national landmark, and it actually became a World Heritage Site under the UN. So we went, and it's about this short ferry ride, about 8 miles from Cape Town, just about like us from Seattle. And there we go into the prison. And this is the prison exercise yard. And what they told us about this that was memorable was that Mandela was writing his autobiography on little tiny pieces of paper, and he'd roll them up and hide them in the plants. And then someone else would come along that had access to the outside and pick up those little pieces. And that's the way his autobiography got out. So of course we went to his jail cell, and that's the outside. And many of you may have seen this picture of this little tiny room with a little flat mat for a bed. And you can imagine entering that and being told, this is where you're going to spend the rest of your life. But I think Mandela never believed it. And of course, he did not spend the rest of his life there. Another way that South Africa has really come to terms with its past is with the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. So, of course, we went there. And we went there with 3 of our friends that we had made while we were in South Africa. The tallest guy in the middle is Nelson Mandela's great-grandson, Luvuyo. And we became good friends with him and 2 of his colleagues, all in Reimagine South Africa. That's an organization that Luvuyo is the executive director of, and these 2 are also active in that. So we were struck by the honesty in the Apartheid Museum. They do not mince words about their past. And one example is, when you enter, you're given a ticket. And randomly selected, you're either a white or a black. You go in an entrance for the whites or the blacks. So I was white, and my friend Mampofo was also a white, and then Dave and Lavoyo and Nobili were blacks. So there you go in and you just begin to experience all that discrimination right from the beginning. So here is just one of the many displays that I was very struck with. So this is a assembly member saying these words in 1950. So this is not all that long ago. And he's saying the white man is the master in South Africa, and the white man, from the very nature of his origins, from the very nature of his birth, and from the very nature of his guardianship, will remain the master in South Africa to the end. Well, so much for that. Dave and I were absolutely fascinated learning the history. They actually start the history like 2,000 years ago, and you begin to see the movements of the indigenous peoples, and then eventually, of course, the Dutch coming in the 17th century and on. So we were fascinated with this. And we went in with these South African friends of ours, but after a while, we noticed they weren't there anymore. And we're looking at all these exhibits, and there's videos, and there's, photographs, and it's a really well done museum. And they sort of disappeared. And, we kind of like, what's with that? They had never been to this museum. It opened in 2001. They had never been. And so we were their excuse to go, but they didn't seem to be all that enthusiastic. So after we had spent a good 2 hours, maybe longer, absorbing this amazing amount of information, we all met in the museum cafe, and we talked for 3 hours. And they told us, this museum is very triggering for us. It is hard to just go through and absorb all of this when it is so much a part of our family's history, grandfather's history, parents' history. And they're young, so they're sort of born just before the transition. But you can imagine it's hard to read the kind of stuff I just read and recognize this horrendous history. The other thing that was very striking to Dave and me was how there is nothing that the South Africans did under apartheid or before that we in the United States have not also done. Whether it's removing indigenous people from their land, or discrimination in housing, discrimination in jobs, a virtual slavery, all of it we have done and they have done. And there's something kind of clarifying, or there's a shock value when you see it in South Africa, and then it's kind of like, oh my God, yes, we've done all of that too. And it was interesting, last night I was listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and she was interviewing Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy. And in the interview, he says, I was inspired for some of the work I've done by the Apartheid Museum. So you may know he created two museums in Montgomery, Alabama. One is the Legacy Museum, and another the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which some people call the Lynching Museum. So it's the same idea. Let's bring these realities forward. Let's process them. Let's deal with them. Let's recognize this all happened. So here, South Africa kind of leading the way for an American to do something related. So that's really quite remarkable and felt very resonant with the kinds of reflections that Dave and I had upon seeing that museum. So on the one hand, we have this victory, Rainbow Nation, everybody talking about Rainbow Nation with rugby victory, the honesty about the past. At the same time, the legacy of apartheid was everywhere. The housing patterns, for example. So, on one side of the road, the shanty towns, and, that black people lived there. And on the other side of the road, these gorgeous homes with the trees and all. And everywhere we went, we kept seeing that kind of contrast. Land ownership. This is the wine country outside of Cape Town. So beautiful. And it, in fact, is where the Club of Rome meetings were held. That land, of course, is owned by white people. And most of the land in South Africa is owned by white people. It was before, and it still is. Now, they've worked on land reform. One person we talked to at length about land reform said they've turned over about 600,000 hectares to black farmers, people who are black, but they're not farmers because they weren't allowed to be farmers. So, of course, for many reasons that we discussed at length, land reform has not been successful and is viewed as maybe something that should be abandoned, even though there's still efforts. So we had a wonderful conversation with a man who is on the kind of a panel to review land reform. And it was especially fun for me because I've worked on this kind of area in the Philippines and Indonesia. And we talked about the method that we had used to try to develop really effective government programs and how they might use some of those methods in South Africa. And he was really interested in that. So that was very fun and thrilling. At the same time, there are so much evidence of the legacy of apartheid. The unemployment rate in South Africa is 27%, and most of that is black. And we were struck as we drove by some of these housing areas and saw that there didn't seem to be much activity in them. We've lived in Ethiopia and Nicaragua and the Philippines and Indonesia, and every place we've lived, when you see sort of poor areas, there's all kinds of entrepreneurship. There's all kinds of little shops, somebody's fixing bikes, and somebody's got a beauty salon, and somebody's got a little drink stand, and there's just lots and lots of activity, and we didn't see that. And we commented on that. What we were told was, of course, that entrepreneurship among the black population was completely suppressed. So you move the families off into these homelands that are very isolated, and you bring the men into the mines. So nothing is designed for entrepreneurship, and the housing arrangements are not designed for entrepreneurship. We kept asking, well, where do people shop? And they said, in the malls. Kind of like, the malls? Are you kidding? This is, in a poor country, people don't shop in the malls. They shop at little shops. Anyway, those were the things that we particularly noticed about the legacy of apartheid. Of course, the government is headed by black people, and many of the ministries and all are headed by blacks. But the corporations, for example, businesses, are mostly headed by whites. So you could see that this legacy, while there was a lot of change, and on the street, you see black and white people walking together, and couples, and lots have changed about how people approach race, and yet structurally, it looked like not a lot had changed. So it seemed like here we are from the United States, we're in a country that is struggling with our own history, trying to make multicultural and multiracial society work, and South Africa is very much the same, struggling to overcome its past and make that society work. So the reason, as Barbara mentioned, the reason we went to South Africa in the first place was because Dave was invited to give a keynote address at the annual meeting of the Club of Rome that was held in South Africa. For me, it was my first time to South Africa. I had been to many African countries, partly when we lived in Ethiopia, but I'd never been to South Africa. But for David, it was not his first trip. It was his second trip. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dave, and he can tell you all about that.
I want to pick up on Fran's thanks to our hosts. In preparing for this and studying the Traveler website, it was such a reminder to me about why I've spent so much of my life promoting local businesses. I mean, they really are different. This is a neighborhood business, and if you study the purpose of why they do these events, surprise, it's not about encouraging you to go buy a ticket and go travel and buy things at the store. It's about expanding our understanding of the world and what we need to do to live together in a better way. Now there's a business purpose. I like that. An extraordinary thing. And I also want to thank them for holding this event, because one of the things it forced both Fran and I to go back and reflect on our South African experience and push ourselves much deeper into our understanding of what we saw and what the larger implications are. And that turns out to be very relevant to the work that we do in our daily life. But, as many of you know, Fran is very active in the local community and our local things around the environment and so forth. My attention tends to be continually focused on the global level and working with organizations and individuals who are trying to redefine our understanding of the human experience and of our human possibilities. And this trip to South Africa was very powerful in that sense. But as soon as you come back, you start focusing on other things, and this drew us back in a wonderful way. Fran mentioned this was my second trip to South Africa. My first visit was in 1992. Mandela was released from prison in 1990 and became president in 1994, so it was right in the middle between that. And the reason for my visit was fairly special. I had a friend who was living and working in South Africa who happened to be working with the efforts of the ANC to prepare those black South Africans who had been in jail for decades with Mandela, prepare them to take over the government. So I was invited to come and present at this series of workshops that were part of that presentation, which was in itself quite an extraordinary experience. But the most extraordinary part of it, which has, I sometimes hesitate to mention this because I can barely describe it without crying. It was so extraordinary. These were individuals who had spent decades in prison under the most extraordinarily harsh conditions. And the thing that they described was how those prisons dehumanized their jailers just as they dehumanized the jailed. This told me there was something, they worked with Mandela, and I've always had the feeling that there was something so extraordinary about this man that he communicated to those that he lived and worked with. That is a qualification for sainthood that I've never experienced anywhere with any group of people that I've met with. And I think this has very much to do with Fran's statement about Vindictus and the understanding of Mandela that, you know, we got to make this rugby an opportunity to bring people together. And this, of course, is part of that framing, that here is Mandela with de Klerk, who was the previous president of South Africa, and together they navigated a peaceful transition. I mean, you could think how this would normally be playing out in most places in the world. Somebody be hanging or have a knife run through him or whatever. But the intention of moving to a multiracial society that worked together in peace and prosperity was truly extraordinary. The thing that I've kind of carved out as my purpose during the discussions with these ANC leaders was based on the experience that Fran and I had had in other parts of the world with the foreign aid system. Because one of the things we knew was that the World Bank and the IMF were just standing there waiting. You know, South Africa had been subject to this boycott from all around the world. So the big international institutions were not making any loans there. International businesses were not going in there. So in a way, South Africa was enjoying a degree of independence and debt-freeness that distinguished it from the rest of the world. And my agenda in these discussions was to try to alert these people to this as an advantage that you have to build on and maintain control of your own economy and your own resources. Because Fran and I have seen over and over how the agenda of those institutions is to push a neoliberal economic agenda, which is about getting people off of their own land and pushing them into essentially servitude. I mean, it's called employment, but, you know, at slave wages with global corporations, while the country is building up international debts to foreign bankers that then push it into exporting its resources to get the foreign exchange to repay these loans. That was a fundamental lesson of our 21 years living abroad and 30 years working in international development. Now, I failed in that mission, as you can well imagine, because those institutions were all standing right there, just ready to swoop in. You know, the IMF and the World Bank considered South Africa to be an under-borrowed country. And, you know, part of what we realized was that, you know, all of this was a buildup after the decolonization, after World War II. And that what this whole process of what we called international development really was a process of recolonization, but in a new form. Now, as I reflect back on this, one of the things I realize is, of course, apartheid, as Fran described, put into place this extreme class division, defined more by race than even most other parts of the world. And what I found when I was there on my first trip was that the new leaders had, you know, they had kind of a political analysis about the importance of democracy and the move to democracy, but they had really no economic analysis. So they had no way to think about this. And, you know, we didn't have enough opportunity to do that. So you kind of see, as you look back, what happened after the transition. And you realize that once you build in extreme inequality into every aspect of the structure, including the infrastructure, as you saw in the way the townships are all laid out, it does not correct itself naturally. If you take it and then set it into this global system that, as we came to understand it, is, again, specifically designed to increase inequality. And this is a thing that's so straightforward, actually, when you think about it. The whole business of putting all your priority on growing GDP, it kind of plays out. It's essentially about maximizing financial returns to people who already have money. So the richer you are, the richer you get. You don't have to have a PhD in economics to figure out where that goes. So in a situation like South Africa, or a situation globally like we now have, if you're going to overcome this inequality, you have to have a very clear set of priorities and a very clear agenda. The Club of Rome, that was the thing that brought us to South Africa. The Club of Rome has a global meeting every year, and this year they held it in South Africa. So what's the Club of Rome? It's a little hard to describe, but a number of you look like you're old enough to remember, as I do, 1972, when a group called the Club of Rome promoted a book called The Limits to Growth. It was written as a report to the Club of Rome. It was based on MIT computer models, The Limits to Growth, and it used very sophisticated modeling techniques to demonstrate the obvious. Infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. Now again, you shouldn't need a PhD in economics to understand that. In fact, I've found over time that if you have a PhD in economics, you probably can't understand that. Anyhow, that's why when anybody accuses me of being an economist, I do the signal. Which is kind of an interesting thing for me now, because I'm getting further into realizing that our movement to the future has to involve a fundamentally new economics. So more and more of my attention is being focused on how do we create a new economics that's based on a totally different logical structure than the one we have now. I've been a member of the Club of Rome since 2002. Part of what distinguishes it, there are 100 full members, they call them, and I was voted into full membership in 2002. Kind of a nondescript organization of big egos is the way I often describe it. We went through a transition. This is an organization that when it started, I don't believe there were any women members. But of course, this was 1972 when, women were, the men get together, and that's just the way things work. Well, in 2018, an interesting thing happened. The women took over the organization, and we had elected into leadership 2 women, Sandrine Dixon de Clave from Belgium and Mamfala Rampella from South Africa. And you know what they did? They do what these women always do. When they took over, they changed the damn organization. They set up a whole set of new programs. They put in initiatives around what we call the climate emergency, which is like, we don't have much time left. If we don't get this carbon out of the air, we're finished. Seems like kind of an important agenda. They put in the emergence of a new civilization, recognizing that if we're going to actually have a human future and survive, it's not like a little tweaking at the edges of the system. We need a new civilization, which means everything must change. So this is about defining what that's about. And if we're going to navigate that change, we're going to need a new economics. So there was an initiative on a new economics. Well, I thought that sounded kind of interesting. So I checked with my friends, and one of them who had been Secretary General of the organization said, well, you need to connect with Mamfala Rampella from South Africa, because she's the one focused on the new civilization, which is the thing you're most interested in. So I sent her an email. She responded, oh, David Korten, she says, I've been using your books in my courses for years. This is one of the kind of amazing things about kind of the course of my life and what I'm finding now, that there are these connections, some of which you don't even know about, but that have been developed over decades, and they connect instantly. And more of these people are ready for this really deep conversation about the changes that we now need to navigate. So Mamfala, who was a leader of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, bore 2 of the children of Stephen Biko, who was one of the major leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. Well, she engineered to have this year's global meeting in South Africa, in Cape Town. And she invited me to come and paid for my trip and so forth so that I could give the lecture on the new economics. This is me and Memphella. Fran says, "You look like you're drunk." And we got the wine there. Anyhow, Fran was taking the picture. But she set up for my presentation at the meeting. But you know, South Africa is quite a long ways away. We spent, I don't know, 20, 22 hours on the plane in each direction. So you don't go there on a lark. But my fellow set up so that we had all these amazing meetings and giving presentations and so forth with her South African colleagues, particularly through the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town, various groups of scientists and so forth, where it was all about engaging this conversation about what would a new civilization look like? Why is the transformation to a new civilization essential? And what might be the role of South Africa and Africa more broadly in that transition? You know, my message to the Club of Rome was pretty straightforward. As a species, we humans are now consuming 1.75 times what Earth can sustain. And the 27 richest people in the world have wealth, financial wealth, equivalent to the financial wealth of the poorest half of humanity, which is something about 3.8 billion people. So 27 versus 3.8 billion. How much inequality is too much? Now, it turns out, by World Bank estimates, South Africa happens to be the most unequal country in the entire world. But this is in a very unequal world. So this is all part of the discussion about the need for a new civilization, which requires a new economics, for which well-being rather than GDP growth is the goal, in which we organize around living systems rather than financial systems. We organize by communities rather than corporations. We make money creation and allocation a public rather than a corporate function. We have to eliminate all of the non-beneficial uses of resources, of which the most obvious example would be war. You know, some people say these changes would create a lot of hardship. Well, how much hardship would we have if we did away with war? And we have to move toward an equitable system of worker and community ownership. So these are just some of the kinds of things that we're exploring in these discussions. So that was the Club of Rome part. And then after that, Fran and I were into these discussions with the South Africans. This is part of where we were staying, and this red carpet was put out for the entrance into my distinguished speaker presentation at the Graduate School of Business at Cape Town University. So we felt very, very distinguished there. So my presentations to the South Africans were very similar to my presentation to the Club of Rome, same essential arguments. And then since, we have been reflecting on what we observed and what we experienced. And one of the things I'm realizing is that, you know, when the black leaders got into the leading political positions in Africa, they were all going at it from this neoliberal frame of economic growth. And the basic image was, you know, if we just do what the World Bank and the IMF and the economists tell us to do, we will all be living like the rich white people in their fancy houses with their fancy cars, and this is going to be all terrific. And of course, it doesn't work that way. As I was thinking about this, part of the neoliberal illusion is that the people who are very rich and making the money are the ones that are creating wealth that will ultimately create the good life for all people. And I was kind of thinking, I wonder if that's what gives Trump his power. Is that the same frame as his followers? That somehow, you know, this guy and his friends are not taking the money away from me. They're creating money that's going to make us all rich. If you understand the fallacy of that, it's really hard to get your mind around that because it doesn't make any sense. And yet I think this is very much what was going on in this transition. And it makes you realize that as long as we didn't rely on the current global economy and its structures, there is no way that we can deal with the issues of inequality and bringing ourselves back into balance with Earth. Now, all these things that begin to flip into place, as Fran mentioned, one of the things we began to realize, boy, the parallels between the United States and South Africa are extraordinary. One thing that's very different is the U.S. has actually led this, what I would call corruption of the whole international system and the foreign aid system, whereas South Africa is just simply a victim of it. But the thing that's fascinating is how we are both in microcosm, like the global world, where there are very few countries in the world that have the same racial distribution. I don't know how many of you noticed that our group tonight is not exactly racially diverse. But as a nation, we have extraordinary diversity. The world has extraordinary diversity. We are extremely unequal. The world is extremely unequal. Wow. How do we deal with the coming together, living in a way that is sustainable within the capabilities of a living Earth, and that has an equitable distribution of the available resources such that allows everyone to live a full, meaningful, and satisfying life? And what are the elements of a truly satisfying life? Is it the massive consumption that we are advertising, we're trying to train and conditioned to try to seek? Or is it something very different in which the real wealth is the strength of the relationships of community and our connection with nature? So these are the kinds of discussions that are beginning to come up out of these experiences. And I think one of the most profound insights I came away with from this South Africa visit was, well, coming back to these this extraordinary experience I had dealing with these newly freed members of the ANC. You know, Africa, well, and this are you know, these museums that we visited, it really pulls you back into the sweep of the human experience. Africa, we don't know exactly what part of it. A lot of people think it's up in Ethiopia where we were before, but it is clearly the birthplace of the species. Now, we also realize that indigenous societies, those earliest societies, many of them people learned to live together and live in balance with Earth, with forms of organization where they essentially maintain control over the power holders. So we didn't have this kind of imperial structure of a few people dominating the many. We began to realize there are profound lessons. It's not that we go back to that way of organizing, but as we are looking for sources of understanding of how we can live in different ways, there is extraordinary knowledge in that experience. Now, with the experience of people like the blacks and South Africans, you know, the tendency is to want to put that all behind you. That's, you know, that's underdeveloped, that's primitive, that's uncivilized. But maybe we all have a lot to learn. What were the lessons those people learned? Maybe the people of Africa and South Africa could regain the respect for their own traditions and respect for what was it that allowed those former captives to have this extraordinary sense of empathy with their jailers. I mean, where does that come from? Anyhow, these are the kinds of things that are going through my mind, and the kinds of things that we reflect on, that in terms of our learning and the challenges at hand and the discussions we need to have, and all within a recognition that science tells us that if we don't basically get our act together and turn this around this year, it will very likely be too late. So that's our challenge. The sweep of the human expansion from Africa out through the world. Let's throw it open from here for, you're certainly free to ask questions, and we'll be happy to respond. But I'm very interested in just any of your reactions or thoughts on any of the things that we've talked about. Implications for Bainbridge Island, or the work that we need to do together here. Whatever comes to mind that you want to take this. Fran's in charge here.
Oh, Fran's in charge.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about the whites and blacks, but in South Africa, my understanding, there's a whole colors, I think they're called, or mixed. Can you talk about that? Your experience with that middle group that was always kind of trying to bridge the gap between both sides.
Yeah, I don't think we have a lot to say on that, Mike. Certainly the majority of the population in South Africa is black. There's a good segment that are called coloreds, and we got kind of confusing message about who is a colored, because you have people from the Malay-speaking world who had come to South Africa, and many of those people, sort of Asian, Malaysian-looking people, had been integrated into the society also. So were coloreds people born of a black and a white, like Trevor Noah? Maybe, but definitely these Malay, often Muslim peoples who had also migrated as they traveled these straits. And of course, Cape Town was this stopover for the Dutch, for the English, and for the Malay, that then are indeed an important part of the society. But that's about all I can say on that topic, yeah. Other comments as well as questions are most welcome, because many of you have your own experiences that you might want to share.
Well, Fran, maybe you know this, but Mahatma Gandhi
Yes.
grew up in South Africa and
Yes,
was a
he
victim
did.
of apartheid
Yes.
and fought that, and that some of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement around Mandela were of Indian heritage.
Yes.
They were coloreds.
Yes, absolutely.
One individual in particular who spent 20 years in jail
Yes.
with him,
Right.
whose name I've forgotten.
Yes.
So they did play a big role,
They did.
and
They
do
did.
today.
Yes. And of course, Gandhi would have been classified as one of the coloreds. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I want to bring in here that, again, was part of our experience, and I suspect is part of the experience of a number of you in this room who, we may be the oldest people in the room, but not by that much. I'm 82, by the way. But our first experience living overseas was in Ethiopia in the mid-'60s. And of course, at that period of time, our only, jet airplanes were fairly new, so that mode of transportation was fairly new. But our only mode of communication with back home was snail mail. So it takes weeks. So you become very conscious with that kind of experience of what a different world this is, and how fast we have become a truly global, interdependent species, where we can now sit down with our computer and talk with audio-visual with virtually anybody in the world instantly. That's a very profound change. And what we have to do at this point is learn to live together as a multiracial, multicolor, multicultural global species that brings together in a workable way all of the differences that we actually have in this country if we actually brought people together. And it's something that we haven't really learned to do most any place that I'm aware of. And yet part of what I find fascinating about this is if we're going to have a human future, we have to draw on all of the sources of our human understanding and human knowledge and bring them together into a whole new way of living. And so a very important part of that input is the input from these different cultures, and particularly from indigenous peoples who, in some ways, though it was very isolated, many of the dynamics and patterns were perhaps things from which we absolutely have to learn at this moment in time.
Yes, I'm interested in your comments about South Africa is dealing with their history. And I'm wondering, since you brought up Brian Stevenson, do you have hope that we are going to deal with our racial history and presence?
Yes, yes, and of course that is the point that he is making. Some of you have heard of Brian Stevenson and these museums that he was the kind of energy behind in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course we have various museums and landmarks, Trail of Tears, etc., that recognize our past. But I think his feeling, and I would tend to agree, that we have not faced really fully our past. Now, of course, in South Africa, the black people are now in charge of the government, so they can kind of get behind an apartheid museum or Robben Island or whatever. And yet, really coming to terms with everything that has happened, I think, is a long journey ahead for them, as it is for us. And what more we can do. I know Joan Walters is here, yes, board chair of our own historical museum. And I think in that museum we are making some progress in recognizing our past, our Native American history, of course the Japanese internment history, etc. So we have our memorials, so I think we're working on it, but also have a long way to go. Yes.
Kat, with a little insight into your schedule while you were there, I know that you spent the equivalent of several days in the university settings and had the opportunity to meet with faculty and graduate students in business and philosophy and science, and there's the food lab. What's your sense of the readiness for the younger generation to kind of take hold and take the reins of making these big changes, and their readiness to hear a story about a transformational civilization?
Yeah. Well, I'll share my overall impression, and Fran was able to observe that, and she retains more of the specifics than I do because I'm so into each individual thing that I don't have a good memory for these things. But my sense was that there was a phenomenal readiness for this conversation, which I actually am finding around the world in ways that I've never experienced before. I mean, I think we're experiencing it in this community also. People are realizing that, to use the technical term, we are in really deep shit. And changes have to come, and they have to come very fast. This is new. I mean, a lot of us have had a sort of inklings of it. But I was stunned by how little sense I came away with that these deeper discussions about the systems and the nature of the changes that are necessary, how little progress there's been on those discussions so far. And I'm wondering, I remember that varied somewhat between different groups. So what was your?
Well, let me just say that, Dave comes with this very radical message, and he was extremely well received at the Club of Rome and at the Cape Town University Business School. And of course, he's got all these business school credentials, so it's really cool, Stanford, Harvard, etc. So that's a real asset, talking to business school here. And people were absolutely receptive, engaged, welcoming, and yet, as Dave suggests, this level of discussion felt like it was not one that they were having very much, and partly why they were so enthusiastic about our being there. And one person, we had a big group of various faculty members and graduate students from the science faculty and some other faculties at the, not the business school, but the actual University of Cape Town. And one of the people there said, you know, the people in this room don't know each other. And here we are, we're all excited about this. We need to form a network and keep this going. We don't know if they did, but she was a very energetic woman, and I wouldn't be surprised if she formed something. So that's what I can tell you about the experience that was very gratifying for us. And many of these groups that we met with in the university were extremely diverse racially. We met with the Innovations Lab. There were about 50 people in the room, mostly between like 20, 30s, and 40s. They were youngish. And it was every color you could imagine. And just all seemed to just be enjoying each other so much and loved the Innovation Lab and were thrilled with what we had to say. So, yeah, are they ready for the deeper discussion? Yeah, are any of us ready for it?
Well, there's another piece here that any of you who are involved in academia, particularly in higher education, are surely aware of this. Our educational system is so siloed by disciplines. And one of the things having been on the Harvard faculty, it kind of helps you see that the more prestigious the university, the narrower the specialties are. The more pressure on you to develop your expertise in whatever this little narrow thing is so that you are the expert. But everything of significance in our world is interconnected, and that's where the breakthroughs are coming in science, that its relationships are far more important than the pieces. And academia, as it exists, is not organized to deal with that. It sometimes makes me wonder whether, reforming our current educational systems makes sense, or whether we need to start out altogether with something totally different. But it's part of our crisis, part of why we're in the crisis.
Mike?
If nobody else has one. I'm curious, you talked about these ideas being discussed there. What's your experience, maybe David and Fran, of these ideas being talked about here in the United States of America?
Same thing. It's kind of a new discussion. And it is opening up in terms of the readiness. We've been involved in some of these discussions within the Parliament of the World Religions, which is the oldest and I believe largest interfaith organization in the world. I'm getting into more and more of these conversations within a professional group called the Academy of Management, which is an association of many of the business school professors globally. But they're very new, and they're very partial, and they're fleeting, and at one level encouraging because they're starting to happen, at another level very discouraging because you realize, oh my God, we've got so far to go, and got to be done this year. I mean, but the other thing that I want to share in this that we realize, there is something special about humans. We create our reality in our mind. All of our major institutions, government, corporations, money, religious organizations, educational institutions, in a sense, they all exist in our mind. They are creations of the human mind. There is nothing in nature that can recognize any of them, and even human beings cannot recognize them unless we are educated to do so. So there is no barrier to the change other than the flip of the mind. And I find that a source of hope.
And I would say, Mike,
different disciplines are in their silos, And I think, as an academic, I think a lot of that is because we think our silos are the best, and that's what we know about.
Particularly if you're an economist.
And we're territorial. And so, and you say, how can we change this? It seems to me that if we could, as a priority, instead of talking about me, we could talk about we.
Yes.
And that's a mindset. We create that reality, but that's powerful because you're taking away my identity and my job and what I believe is right, and sharing that. And I think that's what indigenous people really were masters at.
Yes.
I mean, the tribal chief didn't have 7 teepees, he had 1 teepee. Everybody had 1 teepee because it was about we, not me. So
I think that's especially interesting. Thank you for that point. While we were in South Africa, a lot of people talked about Ubuntu, which may be a word some of you know. It's often translated as, I am because you are. I am because we are. And talk about kind of an Ubuntu culture and how do we get there. But Mike, I want to come back to you and the matter of what Dave is commenting, that somehow there seemed to be a new level of discussion in many different forums that we haven't seen quite so intensely before. And of course, the reason is the climate emergency. And, many of you know Mike is the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Committee for our city. And, you know, we are recognizing this as a climate emergency, and it is causing people to be willing to think in very new ways. And we were experiencing that in South Africa as well as here and so many other places.
So here's one of the frameworks that I've gotten increasingly intrigued with that ties in with Ubuntu. As you look at our leading edge understanding of life and what life is, it is basically a struggle against entropy. The loss of order that the physicists say is characteristic of the whole cosmos. Life is a resistance against that. And one of the things that comes out of this is a recognition that life, which is this distinctive thing that we barely understand, I mean, it's really so incredibly mysterious once you start taking it apart. All the evidence is that it can only exist in communities of organisms that are self-organizing to create and maintain the conditions of their mutual existence. And that is basically how we understand the nature of this planet and why it seems to be distinctive among all of the potentially trillions of planets. Because life made it different. And our very existence depends on that living community of Earth and its health, which of course is the community that we are hell-bent on destroying. Oh. Are we an intelligent species? Or do we have the intelligence to recover? You know, we're dedicated to the idea that I don't know whether we do or not, but I'm going to do my damnedest as long as I'm still alive to try to prove that we do have the capability and intelligence to change.
And on that note, thank you.
Can I say just one thing before we start?
You may.
And that is that I have learned so much tonight. I cannot thank you enough, and I hope I can put it to use.
Thank you.
So I want to thank John McKenzie for being willing to come out on this night and do this video tape. That's a great blessing because we had many people who said, I'm so sorry I can't come. Is there any record of this? And I also want to call out Kat Jovic. Our visit to South Africa would not have worked without the kind of coordination that Kat did. It was intense. I mean, we were meeting several people, several groups every day, and different parts of the city, and who's going to pick us up, and how are we going to get there. And it was intense and very exciting and productive, and a great use of our time. So thank you, Kat, for making that possible.
I would say a lot of things in this community would not work without Kat.
Yeah.
So Dave and Fran will be here to talk informally, but I know people need to be on with their evening.